Picture this. You're scrolling through social media and someone drops a video claiming aliens built the pyramids because ancient Egyptians were too primitive to figure out basic engineering. Then bam, you realize millions of people actually believe this nonsense. But here's the thing that really gets me fired up. The real story of how the pyramids were built is so much more incredible than any alien theory you've ever heard. We're talking about one of the most sophisticated engineering projects in human history, accomplished with nothing but human ingenuity, mathematical brilliance, and sheer determination. I've spent months diving deep into the latest archaeological evidence, talking to actual Egyptologists, and piecing together the real techniques that made these monuments possible. And what I discovered will completely change how you think about ancient civilizations. By the end of this series, you're going to understand exactly how 2,500 tons of limestone blocks were lifted hundreds of feet into the air without cranes, how workers achieved precision that rivals modern construction, and why the alien theories are not just wrong, but actually insulting to one of humanity's greatest achievements. But first, let me tell you why this matters so much more than you think. See, when we dismiss ancient accomplishments as impossible without extraterrestrial help, we're basically saying our ancestors were idiots. We're erasing the incredible problem-solving abilities that got us to where we are today. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the dark. They were master engineers, mathematicians, and organizers who solved problems we still struggle with. The Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't just some random pile of rocks. For over 3,800 years, it was the tallest human-made structure on Earth. Think about that. 38 centuries. The Empire State Building held that record for less than 40 years. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could people without modern technology possibly move blocks weighing as much as pickup trucks? How did they achieve angles precise to fractions of degrees? How did they coordinate tens of thousands of workers without computers or even paper? Those are exactly the questions we're going to answer, and trust me, the solutions are way more ingenious than anything Hollywood has cooked up. Let's start with the biggest misconception floating around. The pyramids were not built by slaves. This idea comes from old Hollywood movies, not historical evidence. Recent discoveries have completely revolutionized our understanding of who actually built these monuments. Archaeological teams have uncovered entire worker villages near the pyramids. These weren't slave quarters. They were organized communities with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and even cemeteries where workers were buried with honor. The skeletal remains tell a fascinating story. These people were well-fed, received medical care when injured, and were clearly valued members of society. We're talking about skilled craftsmen, seasonal farmers working during flood periods, and specialized teams who spent years perfecting their techniques. The ancient Egyptians had developed what might be the world's first large-scale project management system. But here's where it gets really interesting. The workforce wasn't just randomly throwing stones around. They had developed incredibly sophisticated organizational structures. Different teams specialized in different tasks. Some focused on quarrying, others on transportation, others on precise placement. They had foremen, quality control inspectors, and even what we might call safety coordinators. The logistics alone would make modern project managers weep with envy. We're talking about coordinating the delivery of thousands of tons of materials, feeding and housing tens of thousands of workers, and maintaining quality standards that would impress NASA. And speaking of materials, let's talk about where these massive stones actually came from. The limestone blocks that make up most of the pyramid were quarried right there on the Giza Plateau. You can still see the quarry sites today. But here's what's mind-blowing: the precision with which they cut these blocks using copper tools and simple techniques. They didn't just hack away at the rock randomly. Egyptian quarry workers had developed systematic methods for extracting blocks of specific sizes. They would create channels around the desired block, insert wooden wedges, then soak the wedges with water. As the wood expanded, it would crack the stone along predetermined lines. But the real engineering marvel was moving these blocks. And this is where the alien theorists completely missed the point. The Egyptians didn't need anti-gravity technology. They had something better: human ingenuity, and mathematical understanding. Recent experiments by archaeologists have proven that relatively small teams could move massive blocks using nothing but ropes, wooden rollers, and carefully designed ramps. The key wasn't brute force, it was leverage, friction reduction, and coordinated teamwork. One of the most fascinating discoveries came from studying tool marks on the stones themselves. These marks tell the story of the construction process like fingerprints at a crime scene. Different tools left different patterns, and by analyzing these patterns, researchers have been able to reconstruct the exact techniques used for cutting, shaping, and placing each block. The precision of the Great Pyramid is absolutely staggering. The base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that wasn't matched until the invention of modern surveying equipment. The angles are so precise that the margin of error is less than what most modern buildings achieve. How did they do this without laser levels or GPS? They used the stars. Ancient Egyptian astronomers had mapped the night sky with incredible accuracy. They used stellar alignments to establish true north, and they had developed mathematical techniques for creating perfect right angles and maintaining consistent slopes. But here's something that really blew my mind when I first learned about it. The Egyptians had essentially invented trigonometry 2,000 years before the Greeks supposedly discovered it. They understood the mathematical relationships between angles and sides that made their precision possible. The internal structure of the pyramids reveals even more sophisticated engineering. The weight distribution system that prevents the entire structure from collapsing under its own weight is a masterpiece of physics. They created stress-relieving chambers, used different types of stone for different structural purposes, and designed the internal passages with gradients that still puzzle engineers today. And we haven't even talked about the most impressive part yet. The construction process itself required solving problems that would challenge modern construction teams. How do you maintain accuracy as you build? How do you get higher? Materials to the upper levels? How do you ensure the structure remains stable as you add millions of tons of weight? The ancient Egyptians developed solutions that were so effective, their pyramids have stood for over 4,000 years. Most modern buildings are designed to last maybe a century. The pyramids have survived earthquakes, sandstorms, and everything nature could throw at them. What really gets me is how the alien theorists completely ignore all this incredible human achievement. They look at something amazing and immediately assume it must be impossible for humans to accomplish. That's not just wrong. It's deeply disrespectful to our species' problem-solving capabilities. The truth is, ancient humans were just as intelligent as we are today. They had the same capacity for innovation, creativity, and logical thinking. What they lacked in technology, they made up for with ingenuity, patience, and sheer determination. Every single aspect of pyramid construction can be explained through documented techniques, proven physics, and archaeological evidence. There's no mystery that requires extraterrestrial intervention. There's just really impressive human engineering. But understanding how they did it requires us to think differently about ancient capabilities. We have to stop projecting our technology-dependent mindset onto people who solved problems through direct observation, mathematical reasoning, and collaborative effort. The pyramid builders weren't working with inferior minds. They were working with different tools. And in many ways, their solutions were more elegant than anything we use today. They created structures that have lasted longer than our civilization has existed, using nothing but human intelligence and natural materials. This is just the beginning of the story. In the next part, we're going to dive deep into the specific techniques they used to quarry, transport, and lift those massive blocks. We'll explore the ramp systems that made vertical construction possible, and I'll show you exactly how teams of ordinary humans accomplished what still seems impossible today. Because once you understand the real methods behind pyramid construction, you'll realize that the greatest mystery isn't how they built them. The greatest mystery is why we ever thought they needed help from outer space. Human beings have always been capable of incredible things when we work together, think creatively, and refuse to accept that something can't be done. The pyramids aren't evidence of alien intervention. They're evidence of what humans can accomplish when we set our minds to solving seemingly impossible problems. And that's a much more inspiring story than any science fiction movie could ever tell. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these ancient engineers actually moved 20-ton blocks of stone without a single machine we'd recognize today. First, we need to talk about the ramp systems, because this is where most people's brains just shut off. They imagine some impossible vertical lift and immediately jump to alien technology. But the Egyptians had figured out something way more clever than defying gravity. They built ramps. Not just any ramps, though. We're talking about massive, carefully engineered earthwork systems that would make modern highway engineers jealous. These weren't simple straight inclines either. Recent archaeological evidence suggests they used complex spiral ramps that wrapped around the pyramid as it grew taller. Picture this massive construction site. You've got these enormous earthen ramps spiraling up the sides of the pyramid, getting longer and longer as the structure rises. Workers are hauling blocks up these ramps using wooden sledges, ropes, and coordinated human power. It's like the world's most organized construction project happening in slow motion over decades. But here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't just wing it with random ramp designs. These ancient engineers had calculated the optimal angles for moving heavy loads. Too steep, and the ramps become impossible to use. Too shallow, and they become impossibly long. They found the sweet spot that balanced efficiency with practicality. And the evidence for these ramp systems isn't just theoretical. Archaeologists have found remnants of these massive earthworks around various pyramid sites. You can literally see where they built these temporary mountains of earth and sand to construct their permanent monuments. Now, let's talk about the actual moving process, because this is where human ingenuity really shines. They weren't just dragging blocks across sand like you see in movies. The Egyptians had developed sophisticated techniques for reducing friction and maximizing the pulling power of their work teams. They used wooden rollers placed under the sledges carrying the stone blocks. But not just round logs randomly thrown down. These were carefully shaped and sized rollers that distributed weight evenly and rolled smoothly across prepared surfaces. They even created wooden tracks in some areas, essentially building temporary railways out of timber. Water played a crucial role too. They would reduce friction with pour water in front of the sledges to the sand. Recent experiments have shown that the right amount of water can cut the force required to pull a heavy sledge by up to 50%. Too little water and you're still fighting friction. Too much and the sledge gets stuck in mud. They had figured out the perfect balance through trial and error over generations. The coordination required for this process is absolutely mind-boggling. Imagine dozens of workers pulling on ropes attached to a single massive block. Without proper timing and technique, people would be working against each other, potentially injuring themselves and making zero progress. The Egyptians developed work songs and rhythmic chanting that kept everyone synchronized. These weren't just random songs either. Archaeological evidence suggests they had specific chants for different types of work. Moving blocks required different rhythms than lifting them into place. The acoustic properties of these work songs helped coordinate teams across distances where visual signals moving the wouldn't work. But blocks was only half the challenge. Once they got these massive stones to their destination, they had to lift them into precise positions. This is where the alien theorists really lose their minds, because the precision required seems impossible without modern equipment. Here's what actually happened. Developed lever systems that could lift the Egyptians enormous weights using mechanical advantage. They would build temporary platforms and use long wooden levers with stone fulcrums to gradually raise blocks into position. Multiple teams working with coordinated lever systems could lift weights that would be impossible for the same number of people working without mechanical advantage. They also used what engineers call controlled demolition techniques. As they built the pyramid higher, they would construct temporary earthen platforms around each level. Once the stones were in place, they would carefully remove these platforms, essentially excavating around their completed work. This allowed them to position blocks with incredible precision at heights that would otherwise be unreachable. The mathematical precision of the pyramid construction becomes even more impressive when you understand their measurement systems. The Egyptians had developed standardized units of measurement that were consistent across their entire civilization. The royal cubit, their primary building measurement, was based on the length of the pharaoh's forearm plus hand, but they had created physical standards that ensured consistency. Every major construction project used cubit rods made from granite or other durable materials. These served as the ancient equivalent of a meter stick, ensuring that measurements remained accurate across different work teams and time periods. The precision of these measurement systems rivals anything we use today. They had also figured out how to maintain accuracy as structures grew taller. This is actually one of the biggest challenges in large-scale construction. Small errors at ground level become massive problems hundreds of feet up. The Egyptians developed surveying techniques that could detect and correct tiny deviations before they became structural disasters. Using plumb lines, water levels, and stellar observations, they could maintain vertical accuracy and proper angles throughout the entire construction process. They would regularly check their work against astronomical alignments, essentially using the stars as a cosmic quality control system. The internal architecture of the pyramids reveals even more sophisticated engineering solutions. The passages and chambers weren't just randomly carved out, they were precisely designed to distribute structural loads and prevent collapse. The corbelled ceilings in the internal chambers use a technique that channels weight around hollow spaces, creating incredibly strong structures without modern materials. The ventilation systems inside the pyramids show they understood airflow dynamics. These weren't just random holes in the rock. They were carefully calculated passages that allowed air circulation throughout the internal spaces. Some researchers believe these passages also had astronomical significance, aligned with specific stars that held religious importance. But let's talk about something that really drives me crazy about alien theories. They assume ancient people couldn't possibly understand physics or engineering principles. That's completely backwards. These civilizations had to understand physics better than we do in many ways, because they couldn't rely on technology to solve problems for them. When a modern engineer designs a bridge, they run computer simulations to test different scenarios. Ancient engineers had to understand the underlying principles so well they could predict structural behavior through pure mathematical reasoning and accumulated experience. In some ways, that requires deeper knowledge than our computer-assisted approach. The Egyptians had developed empirical engineering knowledge through generations of trial and error. They understood load distribution, structural stability, and material properties through direct observation and testing. Their knowledge was practical and proven through real-world application. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of pyramid construction, the quality control systems. These weren't just massive construction projects where anything went. The Egyptians had developed inspection procedures that ensured consistent quality throughout the building process. Different teams had different responsibilities, and there were oversight systems that checked their work. Stone blocks had to meet specific dimensional tolerances. Placement had to achieve precise alignments. The finishing work on the outer casing stones was held to standards that would impress modern craftsmen. The remaining casing stones on some pyramids show tool marks that reveal the techniques used for final shaping and polishing. These weren't random chisel marks. They show systematic approaches to creating smooth, precisely angled surfaces using copper tools and abrasive materials. And here's something that completely destroys the alien theory. We can see the learning curve. The earlier pyramids show experimental techniques and some structural problems that were solved in later constructions. If aliens had provided the technology, why would there be this obvious progression of improving techniques? The bent pyramid shows clear evidence of engineering problems that were corrected mid-construction. The angle was changed partway through building, creating the distinctive bent appearance. This isn't evidence of alien intervention gone wrong. It's evidence of human engineers recognizing and solving structural problems in real time. The step pyramid shows even earlier experimental techniques. It's essentially several smaller pyramids stacked on top of each other, representing an intermediate step between traditional mastaba tombs and true pyramids. You can literally see the evolution of pyramid construction technology through these surviving monuments. Each generation of pyramid builders improved on the techniques of their predecessors. They solved problems, refined methods, and passed knowledge down through apprenticeship systems that maintained continuity across decades of construction projects. This is exactly what you'd expect from human technological development: gradual improvement through accumulated experience and problem solving, not sudden leaps that would suggest external intervention. The tool evidence is equally compelling. We have thousands of copper chisels, wooden levers, rope fragments, and other construction tools from pyramid sites. These aren't mysterious alien artifacts. They're exactly the tools you'd expect from a civilization that had mastered working with available materials. The wear patterns on these tools tell stories about how they were used. Different types of work created different types of wear. Stone cutting required different techniques than woodworking or rope handling. The archaeological record shows a complete toolkit designed for massive construction projects using available technology. What's really impressive is how they optimized these simple tools for maximum efficiency. The copper chisels were designed with specific angles and edge geometries for different types of stonework. The wooden levers had carefully calculated lengths and fulcrum positions for lifting different weights. Even the ropes they used were engineered for specific applications. Different twisting techniques created ropes with different strength characteristics. Some were optimized for pulling heavy loads, others for lifting applications where stretch characteristics mattered more than pure strength. This level of tool optimization doesn't happen overnight. It represents generations of craftsmen experimenting with different approaches and gradually improving their equipment. This is human technological development in action, not alien technology transfer. The organizational systems required for pyramid construction are equally impressive and completely human in scale. These weren't just random work gangs throwing stones around. The Egyptians had developed project management systems that coordinated thousands of workers across multiple specialized tasks. Different teams had specific responsibilities and worked according to carefully planned schedules. Quarry teams had to produce blocks at rates that matched the capacity of transport teams. Transport teams had to deliver materials at rates that matched the placement capacity of construction teams. This required understanding workflow optimization, resource allocation, and timing coordination that would challenge modern project managers. They had to solve all these problems without computers, phones, or even paper-based communication systems. The communication systems they developed are fascinating when you start thinking about the practical challenges. How do you coordinate teams spread across a massive construction site when the loudest voice can only carry maybe 100 yards? The Egyptians figured out relay systems using horn signals, flag signals, and messenger networks that could transmit information across the entire project site. They had developed what were essentially ancient radio networks using visual and audio signals. Different horn patterns meant different things. Flag positions communicated status updates. Messenger runners carried complex instructions between work areas. This wasn't just people randomly shouting at each other. The scheduling systems they used blow my mind even more. They had to coordinate seasonal work patterns with the flooding of the Nile, religious festivals, and the availability of different types of workers. Farmers could only work on pyramid construction during certain times of year. Skilled craftsmen were needed for specific phases of the project. Everything had to be planned years in advance. Recent analysis of worker village remains shows they had developed sophisticated logistics systems for feeding and housing thousands of people. These weren't just temporary camps thrown together randomly. They were planned communities with infrastructure for food production, waste management, and medical care. The bakeries at these sites could produce thousands of loaves per day. The breweries provided not just refreshment, but also safer drinking water than what was available from other sources. The medical facilities show evidence of treating work-related injuries with techniques that were advanced for their time. What really gets me is how they solved problems we still struggle with today. Construction site safety, for example. The skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show that serious injuries happened, but they also show evidence of medical treatment and recovery. These weren't disposable workers being ground up in some death machine. They had developed safety protocols that minimized accidents during extremely dangerous work. Moving multi-ton blocks of stone is inherently risky, but the injury patterns suggest they had systematic approaches to reducing those risks. Workers who were injured received care and often returned to work after recovery. The quality of life for these workers was actually pretty impressive by ancient standards. They ate meat regularly, which was a luxury for most people in that time period. They had access to medical care. They were buried with grave goods that showed social respect. These were valued members of society, not slaves being worked to death. But let's get back to the engineering, because there's still so much more incredible stuff to unpack. The foundation systems of the pyramids are masterpieces of civil engineering that solved problems most people never even think about. You can't just start stacking millions of tons of stone on random ground and expect it to stay stable for thousands of years. The Egyptians had to create foundations that could distribute enormous loads across different types of soil and bedrock. They surveyed the construction sites, analyzed soil conditions, and designed foundation systems accordingly. The Great Pyramid sits on a foundation that's level to within centimeters across a base covering over 13 acres. They achieved this using techniques that required understanding differential settling, load distribution, and soil mechanics, without soil testing equipment or engineering software. They cut into bedrock in some areas and built up with carefully selected fill materials in others. The foundation design compensated for natural variations in the underlying geology. This required geological knowledge that we're only beginning to appreciate through modern archaeological investigation. The drainage systems around the pyramids show they understood water management and its effects on structural stability. They designed channels and collection systems that directed water away from the foundations. Some of these drainage features are still functional today, over 4,000 years later. Water is one of the biggest enemies of large stone structures. It can cause foundations to shift, create freeze-thaw cycles that crack stones, and undermine structural stability in dozens of ways. The pyramid builders had figured out comprehensive water management systems that protected their constructions from these threats. The precision of the internal passages becomes even more impressive when you understand the surveying challenges involved. These passages had to maintain specific angles and directions while being carved through solid stone, often in multiple directions simultaneously. They were essentially doing three-dimensional surveying and construction without any of the instruments we consider essential for that kind of work. No transits, no laser levels, no GPS, no computer modeling. Just mathematical knowledge, careful measurement, and incredible attention to detail. The passages that connect different internal chambers required calculating three-dimensional angles that had to remain consistent across hundreds of feet of construction. The margin for error was essentially zero, because any deviation would result in passages that didn't connect or chambers that weren't properly aligned. Some of the internal passages changed direction multiple times, requiring the builders to maintain accuracy through complex geometric calculations. They had to account for the thickness of stone blocks, the precise positioning of chambers, and the structural requirements of the overall design. The fact that these passages were built from both ends and met in the middle with perfect accuracy shows mathematical and surveying capabilities that rival anything we can do today. They were working through solid rock without the ability to see where they were going, relying entirely on calculations and measurements. The acoustic properties of some internal chambers suggest the Egyptians understood sound engineering as well. Certain chambers have acoustic characteristics that amplify or modify sounds in specific ways. Whether this was intentional or accidental is still debated, but the precision suggests intentional design. The electromagnetic properties of the pyramids have generated all sorts of wild theories, but the reality is probably much more mundane. The specific types of stone used and their mineral content create certain electromagnetic effects, but these are explained by basic physics and geology, not alien technology. What's really fascinating is how different types of stone were used for different structural purposes throughout the pyramids. The builders understood material properties and selected stones accordingly. Harder stones for areas that needed strength, softer stones for areas that needed to be carved or shaped, different stones for different aesthetic effects. The transportation logistics for getting different types of stone from multiple quarry sites to the construction site required planning that would challenge modern supply chain managers. They had to coordinate deliveries of different materials to arrive when needed, not too early and not too late. Some of the specialty stones came from quarries hundreds of miles away. The red granite used in some internal chambers came from Aswan, which required transporting multi-ton blocks down the Nile River. The logistics of loading, transporting, and unloading these stones using ancient technology is mind-boggling. They built special boats for transporting heavy stones. These weren't just regular river boats scaled up. They were specifically engineered vessels designed to handle loads that would sink normal boats. The engineering of these transport boats was nearly as sophisticated as the pyramid construction itself. The timing of these deliveries had to coordinate with Nile flood cycles, which determined when the river was deep enough for heavy cargo boats. They had to plan stone deliveries years in advance, accounting for quarrying time, transport scheduling, and construction timelines. All of this coordination happened without modern communication or transportation infrastructure. No phones, no computers, no trucks, no modern roads. Just human organization and planning on a scale that most modern projects can't match. The preservation techniques they used to protect finished work during the decades-long construction process show they understood materials science and weathering effects. Temporary protective coverings, careful scheduling to minimize exposure to weather, surface treatments that prevented deterioration. They were essentially running multiple massive construction projects simultaneously, because different pyramids were often under construction at the same time. This required dividing skilled workers between projects, coordinating material deliveries to multiple sites, and maintaining quality standards across different locations. The administrative systems required for tracking all this work would challenge modern project management software. They had to track worker assignments, material inventories, work progress, quality control, and dozens of other variables across projects that lasted decades. Recent discoveries of ancient papyrus records show they had developed sophisticated record-keeping systems for construction projects. These weren't just random notes. They were systematic documentation of work assignments, material deliveries, and progress tracking. The mathematical knowledge required for all this coordination is staggering. They had to understand geometry, trigonometry, logistics optimization, resource allocation, and project scheduling, all without calculators or computers. But here's what really drives me crazy about people who insist aliens must have been involved. Every single technique I've described can be demonstrated using materials and methods available to ancient Egyptians. Archaeological experiments have proven that small teams can accomplish seemingly impossible tasks using ancient techniques. Modern teams have successfully moved multi-ton stones using ancient methods. They've demonstrated the effectiveness of lever systems, ramp systems, and coordinated human power. The techniques work exactly as the evidence suggests they were used. The precision achievable with ancient surveying methods has been proven through experimental archaeology. The mathematical knowledge required for pyramid construction was well within the capabilities of ancient Egyptian scholars and engineers. There's no gap that requires alien intervention. There's just really impressive human engineering accomplished through intelligence, planning, and determination. The only mystery is why anyone thinks ancient humans needed help from outer space to accomplish what they accomplished through their own brilliance. But we're still not done exploring the incredible techniques these ancient engineers developed. Next, we're going to dive into the most mind-blowing part of the whole construction process: how they achieve the precision that makes modern engineers shake their heads in disbelief. Because once you understand the measurement and quality control systems they used, you'll realize that calling their work primitive is like calling a Stradivarius violin a simple wooden box. The precision these ancient engineers achieved is absolutely insane when you start looking at the actual numbers. We're talking about tolerances that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous, accomplished with nothing but rope, wood, and human determination. Let me blow your mind with some measurements. The Great Pyramid's base is square to within 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters across a base that covers 13 acres. That's like drawing a perfect square the size of 10 football fields using only a ruler and getting it accurate to less than an inch. The sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. Modern buildings rarely achieve that level of precision, even with laser surveying equipment and GPS. The ancient Egyptians did it by watching stars and using mathematical calculations that boggle the mind. But here's what really gets me fired up. The corners of the pyramid are all exactly 90 degrees. Not approximately 90 degrees. Exactly 90 degrees. Measured to fractions that our best instruments can barely detect. How do you achieve that kind of accuracy when you're working with blocks that weigh more than cars? They developed measurement systems that were more sophisticated than most people realize. The royal cubit wasn't just some random length based on somebody's arm. It was a precisely standardized measurement that remained consistent across their entire civilization for over 1,000 years. These cubit rods were made from granite and other materials that wouldn't change size with temperature or humidity. They had backup standards stored in temples, essentially creating an ancient version of the International Bureau of Weights and Measures. Every major construction project used measurements that could be traced back to these master standards. But the really incredible part is how they maintained accuracy as they built higher. Imagine you're working on level 50 of a 100-level structure. Any tiny error from the foundation gets magnified by the time you reach that height. A deviation of just 1 degree at the bottom becomes a massive problem hundreds of feet up. The Egyptians solved this through what engineers call error correction systems. They would regularly check their work against known reference points and make tiny adjustments to compensate for accumulated errors. They essentially invented quality control procedures that prevented small mistakes from becoming structural disasters. They used plumb lines that could detect vertical deviations smaller than what the human eye can see. These weren't just strings with weights on them. They were precisely calibrated instruments that could measure angles to incredible accuracy. The weights were carefully shaped to minimize air resistance and swaying. The lines were made from materials that wouldn't stretch or change length. Water levels were another crucial tool for maintaining horizontal accuracy. But not just bowls of water like you might imagine. They created sophisticated leveling systems using connected vessels that could detect height differences across enormous distances. These ancient spirit levels were more accurate than many modern tools. The astronomical alignment systems they used are even more impressive. They weren't just randomly pointing things at stars. They had developed mathematical methods for calculating true north using stellar observations, accounting for the rotation of the Earth and the movement of stars across seasons. They built temporary observation structures specifically for surveying purposes. These weren't permanent buildings, but carefully constructed platforms and sighting devices that allowed precise astronomical measurements. Once the surveying was complete, these structures were dismantled and removed. The mathematical knowledge required for these surveying techniques is staggering. They had to understand spherical trigonometry, coordinate systems, and astronomical mechanics. They were doing calculations that we consider advanced mathematics today, using nothing but their understanding of geometric relationships. But let's talk about something that really demonstrates their precision obsession: the casing stones. The original outer surface of the pyramids was covered with polished limestone blocks that fit together so perfectly you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. These casing stones weren't just roughly shaped blocks. Each one was individually cut and polished to fit its exact position on the pyramid. The angles had to be perfect, the dimensions had to be exact, and the surface finish had to meet standards that would impress modern stoneworkers. The tool marks on surviving casing stones reveal systematic approaches to achieving this precision. Different stages of the shaping process use different tools and techniques. Rough shaping with one set of tools, fine adjustment with another, final polishing with specialized abrasives. They had developed what were essentially ancient machine tools. Copper saws with abrasive cutting compounds that could slice through limestone with remarkable accuracy. Drilling systems that could create perfectly round holes using nothing but copper tubes and sand. Polishing techniques that created mirror-smooth surfaces using progressively finer abrasives. The logistics of creating thousands of these precisely fitted stones is mind-blowing. Each stone had to be measured, cut, shaped, and finished before it could be transported to the construction site. The quality control systems had to ensure that stones cut months or years in advance would still fit perfectly when they were finally installed. They were essentially mass-producing custom-fitted components using ancient manufacturing techniques. Each stone was unique, but all had to meet exact specifications. The planning and coordination required for this level of precision manufacturing would challenge modern factories. The internal stonework shows the same obsessive attention to detail. Blocks that nobody would ever see were still cut and fitted with incredible precision. This wasn't just showing off for visitors. This was structural engineering that required perfect fits to maintain stability over thousands of years. The corbelled ceilings in the internal chambers use a technique where each stone is positioned to support the stones above it while transferring loads to the stones below. The calculations required to determine the exact positioning of each stone in these load-bearing systems would challenge modern structural engineers. They had to understand stress distribution, load paths, and failure modes without any of the mathematical tools we use for structural analysis. They figured out these relationships through direct observation, testing, and accumulated experience passed down through generations of builders. The joint compounds they used between stones show sophisticated understanding of materials chemistry. These weren't just random mortars slapped between blocks. They were carefully formulated mixtures designed to remain stable over geological time periods. Some of these joint compounds have properties that we still don't fully understand. They've remained flexible enough to accommodate thermal expansion and structural settling, while staying strong enough to maintain structural integrity. Modern concrete rarely performs that well over decades, let alone millennia. So there you have it. The real story of how the pyramids were built isn't about little green men from outer space. It's about human beings who refused to accept limitations and solved problems through pure intelligence and determination. These ancient engineers accomplished something that still makes modern construction teams shake their heads in disbelief. They moved millions of tons of stone with mathematical precision that rivals anything we can do today. And they did it all using nothing but human ingenuity, careful planning, and an obsessive attention to detail that puts most of us to shame. The next time someone tries to tell you aliens built the pyramids, you can shut that nonsense down with actual facts. Because the truth is so much more incredible than any science fiction story could ever be. Human achievement doesn't need extraterrestrial explanation. It just needs respect.